Welcome back to another video, guys. Today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on the new Sony Alpha 1, or as some people are calling it, the A1. Let's just dive straight in. Now on paper, this camera looks like an absolute beast. It has something practically for everybody, whether you shoot high resolution, whether you shoot super fast, whether you're shooting video. This camera seems to have something for all of us. At the heart of this camera features an all-new 50 megapixel sensor, which has, integrated memory chip, all-new signal processing unit in it. So it's designed to create super fast readouts, which is pushing a lot of the boundaries of what we've seen previously on electronic shutters. So we'll get into that as we get to those specs as well. It's the same form factor as the A9 models, so it uses the same Z batteries, which is great for people who already have those system cameras now. Has a magnesium alloy frame, improved dust and water resistance according to Sony. They've added 17 custom keys and dials. It includes touchscreen operation, so you can also pull and touch autofocus, which I've enjoyed on the last couple of cameras that they've released, A7S III being one of them. Another thing we've seen before is that switching between video and photo modes retains the settings in those modes. Something like that is, it's small, but it makes a huge difference in actual real world working scenarios. Another thing they've carried it over from the A7S III is it's now got a white balance sensor as well as an IR sensor on the front, which should improve color accuracy when you're shooting video and stills. It should be more accurate than ever before. Now let's talk about the electronic shutter, which boasts 30 frames per second, 12-bit, 50 megapixel RAW files. And I think you'll get up to, 80 files before it buffers in RAW, or 96 in their uncompressed RAW format, which is, again, crazy. That should do you over for about 3 seconds of holding the shutter down continuously. So you're not going to miss any kind of action going on if you're shooting tennis or cricket or golf, football. If you're taking a picture of a bird and trying to anticipate it taking off, you're going to get every single action, from the moment it starts all the way through. That whole sequence is going to be captured at 30 frames per second, which is insane. If you want to shoot uncompressed RAW, then I think it will give you 20 frames per second, which again is still insane. One thing that is curious though is that despite the new shutter mechanism, the new processing, the A1 still matches the A9 II in terms of mechanical frames per second. So it can only do 10 frames per second mechanically, which does seem a bit low when you consider that, Canon has been pushing 14 frames per second in their 1D series cameras, and the R5 and R6 can do 12 frames per second with mechanical shutter. So it seems like, well, I would have expected more at this price point for the mechanical shutter, but they are pushing the technology in terms of what the electronic shutter can do. So now we're not getting as much distortion. It's got an anti-distortion shutter. So, when you're shooting action, you're not going to get that jello effect as it reads out slowly. It doesn't bend the image as much. So that should be much improved. Also, one of the things I really, really like the look of is they've got an anti-flicker mode in there that can automatically detect flicker in the scene. So if you're shooting indoor sports, for example, or if you're shooting with LED lights like I do often when I'm doing product photography, one of the issues is getting flicker, like banding across the images, and it's really, really frustrating if you're using a camera that can't combat that. Well, this camera can. They've said that the new mechanical shutter is rated to 500,000 actuations, which is bonkers. If you haven't owned a professional camera before, or if you have and you've never checked this out, I've owned the A7R II since just before it came out, so about 6-7 years now. And so far I think my actuations is around 50,000 in 7 years. And this is rated to 500,000 actuations. It's got carbon fiber shutter blades. So this camera should last you a good long time. What else have they got? Oh, one of the cool things that is worth mentioning while we're talking about sports is the Viewfinder. I think it's 9.44 million dots, which sounds crazy off the bat anyway. It's got 240 hertz refresh rate, which is lag free when you're looking straight through that. It should be as good as optical, if not better, I'd say, if you've got that resolution and that speed, and then the additional information overlaid as well. I don't see how this could be. I'm looking forward to testing it because I don't see how it could be any worse than optical, and I do see many ways in which it could be better. But the thing I was going to say, which is the most exciting thing, is there's no blackout while you're shooting at those high frame rates. One of the issues that people will experience if they've used previous cameras that can shoot at high frame rates is a blackout between each shot. And a great thing that Sony have managed to do, and they did it with the A9, is they've reduced and removed blackout completely. So now you can see the image the whole way through. You can see it tracking autofocus. The A1 also includes Sony's innovative solution to card slots. So it has a dual card slot which accepts both CF Express Type A and SD UHS-1 and UHS-2 cards in either slot. So you don't have to pick or choose, which is amazing. I think that's a really clever way of implementing the tech. One of the cool things as well is you can have the same cards and you can record redundantly. You can even record 8K video redundantly on this camera. So yes, this camera does have 8K video at 30 frames per second, 420 10-bit 8K video. It's an XAVCS format, so it's compressed. It's not an uncompressed or all-I format, not like you're going to get from the R5. So you're unlikely to get the overheating issues that we saw with the Canon R5 when that came out at launch. Interestingly, Sony has also implemented some heat dissipation either side of the body and out of the rear of it as well. So I think it's unlikely that we're going to see the overheating issues that we did when the Canon R5 launched, which is good for Sony. Sony's also implemented a 5.8K oversampling mode for 4K shooting in Super 35, which again, if you want to maximize your detail and your resolution at 4K, that's probably the mode to go for. Another thing I'm really excited to see is 4K at 120 frames per second on this camera with they're saying autofocus and auto exposure is included. I don't know if that means IAF is going to be in there as well, but I'll look forward to testing that out. It's worth noting that in 4K 120, there's a 10% crop, so you're going to lose a little bit of the frame in that mode. But again, great to see 4K 120 implemented. Just like you have with the A7S III, the A1 has a full-size HDMI out, which I am very happy about. That is great. And you can output 16-bit RAW via HDMI. I mentioned in my intro that this camera is aiming to be something for absolutely everybody. And so like we said, we've got the high resolution video, we've got high resolution stills, super fast frame rates, and also data connection speeds that kind of cover every single base. They've got two antennas that support the latest Wi-Fi, so you've got, super consistent, reliable Wi-Fi connections on here. It also has super speed USB 3.2, which is capable of 10 gigabit speeds. Again, we don't necessarily need that right now, but future-proofing the camera with these kind of features is what professionals and people like myself who want camera kit that will last us 5-10 years. I don't want to be upgrading every year. Having that built into the camera is immense. And it kind of makes Ethernet redundant at those speeds, but they've included Ethernet because they still want to have something there for professional and sports shooters who rely on Ethernet cables while they're shooting. So rather than just replacing it with super speed USB 3.2, which is crazy fast, much faster than Ethernet, they've kept the Ethernet there as well for those customers for those shooters who still rely on that technology and still want to use something that they're used to, that their system's set up for. I think that's really clever from Sony to include that. And that's something that I think will tempt people over from those 1DX, those D4 style cameras to this system. That's something that the EOS R5 at the moment can't touch us. I'm assuming when Canon finally releases the EOS R1, their answer to this, then that will probably have similar functionality built into it. Another cool thing about the USB-C input on this, which I didn't mention, is that it means you can tether the camera to a 5G enabled device like the Xperia Pro that they also announced alongside this camera. That means that without any additional plug-in cables or hardwire connections, your camera can be 5G connected to an FTP server, to a streaming service like YouTube, for example. And you only need to make sure you have a 4 megabit per second data connection. So even 4G would be good enough from your phone tethered to this camera to stream live through the Sony Alpha A1 to YouTube with a 720p stream, which is, from looking at what we had even a year ago, to think we can do that now with this camera is quite impressive. One of the cool things about this larger sensor that I haven't seen touched on very much is the ability to crop in with APS-C mode. Now, if you've used Sony Alpha cameras before, that's nothing new. What is new is that they've, rather than just cropping the sensor to give you that smaller image that's slightly more punched in, Sony this time round has oversampled the full image of the sensor to create a 21 megapixel medium file size, which means you're getting a higher resolution image at that, the highest detail at that lower resolution possible. And you're getting the full benefit of the camera's 759 phase detection autofocus points, even in cropped sensor mode, which we didn't have before. Cropping down typically meant cropping the sensor, which meant fewer AF points. So that is an innovation that I think will make a huge difference, especially if you're out there in the field shooting sports, shooting wildlife, and you want to punch in a little bit just to get a bit closer to your subject. You can set a custom button to switch to APS-C mode, and you're not losing autofocus points. Now, one of the things that happens every time a new camera comes out that I find frustrating personally, I'm sure you guys can relate, is the usual talking heads come out, their ambassadors, their product managers will come out and say, this camera is a game changer. And one of the things I always think is when they're looking through, the shiny promo materials and you're seeing the images that they've captured, one of the things I keep thinking is, these aren't images we couldn't capture before. There's nothing new here. So how do you justify spending thousands of pounds on an all new body when we're not seeing images that couldn't be captured before with this camera? Cameras like this, when they're pushing the envelope this far, when you're getting 30 frames per second, full resolution, 50 megapixel images, raw images, is fewer moments are going to be missed at that frame rate. You don't have to plan your shots as thoroughly as you might because there's less chance when you're shooting with frame rates like that at a resolution like that. There's fewer opportunities for things to go wrong when you've got such a reliable data connection. You can back up your images as you shoot with a camera like this. You've got dual cards that offer redundancy even up to 8K video. That's huge. I think that's a meaningful difference that does, those are the things that the ambassadors don't really drive home when they're showing off their images. I'm like, it's a cool shot, but we could do that before. But they're not making the point that I think they should be making, is that these are images that are easier to capture with this system. These are images that I might have missed if I was waiting to set up to make sure I got the perfect angle and to make sure I was the perfect timing to get that moment. There are fewer mistakes when you've got this much leeway in terms of frames per second, in terms of dynamic range. And I think those are the things about this camera that really stand out and that justify the price point for me. This is the same price as a 1DX Mark III right now. And that's the aim, that's the kind of positioning for this camera anyway. This isn't a rival to the R5. This is a rival to what I'm assuming will be the R1, which will be Canon's all bells and whistles answer to this camera. So yeah, you're looking at a very big price gap between the R5 and all of the other cameras at the 3,000 mark, 4,000 mark. This is 6,500. So there is a big difference, but I think you're getting a lot more camera for your money, and not just in terms of feature set, but in terms of future proofing and longevity. Back in 2015, I was fortunate enough to travel to Thailand with Wex Photo Video and the director there. We traveled to Thailand to where Sony produces its G Master lenses. We got to see them before they even started to ship in 2016. And one of the things that stood out for me that they said on that trip was that the lenses they were making in 2015, that are 10 years in planning, and in terms of producing the lens elements, they take years to grow. One of the things that they said that stood out from that trip is that those G Master lenses were being produced to resolve detail from sensors that we don't even have yet. Sensors that are 50 megapixels, 100 megapixels, 200 megapixels, much bigger than what we had at the time, and I guess what we have now. Actually, I didn't even mention this camera can shoot 190 megapixel images as well, 199 megapixel images using pixel shift, which again is wild. And you can use it this time with flash sync up to 1/200th of a second, which you couldn't do before. That's 5 times faster than the A7R4. So even though the A7R4 has a higher native resolution, I think it's 64 or 61 megapixels, I can't remember. But This has a ultra high resolution mode which offers a 199 megapixel image, which takes either 4 or 16 images and composites them down into one. And that's sampling colors, that's sampling detail, all into that one file. So if you're an archive photographer, if you're a product photographer, landscape photographer, that 199 megapixel mode, again, is going to be a huge feature for you to have access to with this camera body. Like I said, it's something for everybody. It's insane. But back to the G Master lenses, they answered, I guess, a lot of the criticism that the Alpha cameras initially had about not having the lens range by thinking ahead and planning ahead with G Master to create lenses that are going to be future proof for this new camera and whatever else comes down the line to follow it, which is, it shows that Sony have been thinking and planning ahead, well ahead of the competition in ways that, Canon and Nikon in particular, just to kind of, I guess they've dropped the ball in a lot of ways. And Sony here are showing that they're kind of still the kings of mirrorless, it seems like, with this camera. Anyway, that's my thoughts on the Alpha 1, the Alpha A1, whatever you want to call it. If you have any comments or questions, I'm hoping to get my hands on it at some point in the coming weeks. So check out my Instagram, GadgetsJON. If I get hold of it, you'll see it first over on there. But if you have any comments or questions of your own, please put them in the comment section below. In the meantime, please subscribe. If you liked the video, give it a like. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down, but then comment and let me know why you didn't like the video. It's always good to have feedback. But otherwise, guys, thanks for watching. That is me, and I guess I'll see you in another video.